thunderstorms. You know how West Virginians are about thunderstorms. We don't like them, we don't like them. Our grandmother said one time that she knew of a friend who had a servant whose brother's cousin got killed in the thunderstorm. You know what I'm saying? Right there. Don't go out in a thunderstorm. I tease West Virginians about swimming. They claim to swim, but they don't. They wade, they fish, throw rocks in the water. They don't swim.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to our Thursday evening lecture series. I'd like to invite you all to always keep check on our website. It tells you what upcoming events we have scheduled. I'll go over a couple of the most recent, but on your way out this evening, feel free to pick up our little cards that are on the end of the table. Looks like this. Just to take with you. Coming up May 7th, we have Reconstructing Bill, the story of Governor William C. Marlin. And that's going to be presented by Russ Barber and Dick Fowles. Dick is running the camera tonight in the back. And a very interesting topic, that's on the Tuesday night program, I might add. Coming up May 9th for our next Thursday night program, we have the haunted history of the West Virginia Penitentiary. That will be a very interesting topic. It is featuring Sherry Brake, and that will be interesting as well. I won't take a lot of time tonight because Greg has just informed me that his program tonight is, he's got a lot of material to present in a short period of time. So tonight's presentation is by one of our very own, Greg Carroll, who retired in October of 2012. And it's nice to have Greg back here to present a program. And this one here is one of his areas of expertise. When he retired here, a lot of knowledge went with him because he focused on our Native American research, our African American research, and Civil War history. And tonight, Greg will present Slavery in Virginia, 1619 to 1860. So that's a lot of years in history to cover. So let's make welcome Greg Carroll.
Good evening. We'll test this speaker out. Everybody can hear me. I'm good at speaking right into the microphone. Some people aren't. Everybody has possibly my little packet or a packet to share. If you don't have them, I can get you one. I once again am old school. I prefer to talk straight to you as opposed to having a whole series of beautiful pictures and or slideshow. I'm not a PowerPoint person. I'd rather us speak person to person and instead of me pushing a button over here on the side somewhere. Although there are very good PowerPoint presentations, don't get me wrong. Tonight we have a very difficult subject, a emotional subject. We know that we could spend 6 months studying this. I'm going to try to give it out to y'all in 48 minutes, so you have to bear with me, and we'll be moving forward. But as we do, think of some good questions to ask, please. Our subject tonight is emotional, and I consider it a vast American tragedy. So don't let historians convince you that they are never affected by their emotions. They are, and that's something that everybody should realize. The kind of historians that claim to be completely partial, well, impartiality, partial, all I can say is everybody is going to be affected by this topic. Their lives are. We've spent from 1619 clear up to the present here in Virginia and West Virginia dealing with this question. So I can only say that it is a very interesting and complex subject, not one that we can talk about very humorously. You will soon see that this question is rife with contradictions, ambiguities, and very deep prejudices. Combine this with the extremely poor way that we were taught this subject in our schools and even at the college level, and we will find ourselves needing to face new facts and discover much about this great human tragedy that we did not know. Once again, I'll admit I'm no expert. I'm hoping to be a interested student just like yourselves. I don't play any academic games, and I don't worry about publication. I worry about getting ideas over to folks. That's what we're going to do tonight. Raised in the South, like I was, I'm a Texan, I was given a very hazy education on the Civil War and its causes, with the question of slavery hardly ever even mentioned. Our idea of this time period was summed up in the colorful myths portrayed by Rhett and Scarlett in Hollywood's Gone with the Wind. What exactly was gone was never very clear. Having spent the last 40 years here in West Virginia on the land of my grandfather and my great-grandfather, I have come to see this state too is really very Southern in its outlook and its sensibilities. The reasons for this, I have come to realize, are based in our connection to slavery despite our woeful ignorance and our almost willful refusal to look this subject in the face. I may be bringing up some controversial realities tonight, but I am of the opinion that we need to do just that, and that knowledge of our history will improve because we have done so. Tonight we'll go over several basics. We only have a few minutes to do this, but those basics are so complex that I'm hoping you will come and utilize your library. The Archives Library itself here can help you. I have some books up here I'll point out to you later if you'd like to do some further study. Let's start with the reasons why slavery as a broad economic system took such a strong root in the Americas, both the North and South. Starting in the 1500s, the spread of empire and colonialism into North and South America was fueled by a greed, a mercantile greed for profit that saw an explosion of the need for new labor. At first, this labor was fulfilled with the Native American population here. You had slavery existing in the Native American population in Virginia as early as the first settlers. You had large numbers of Indian slaves in Mexico before the Spanish government ended slavery, long before we did, I might add. At first, this labor was, easy to use, utilize. All of a sudden, the Indians began to die off. And there's an interesting fact that I found out many years ago, and I always relate it. The smallpox and measles that killed so many Indians was discovered to kill fewer African Americans. Why is that reason? African Americans on the African continent were exposed to cattle. The cattle had cowpox. That cowpox produced an immunity for black folks, and that immunity was not one enjoyed by the Native American people. And And of course, the Indians began to die off just as the demand for labor increased. And you can see how suddenly they began to realize English and Spanish landowners began to realize they needed a vast new form of labor. At first, they tried the indentured servant system. I think most of y'all have heard about that, where working people and convicts were sent to the new colonies to spend a certain amount of time, usually 7 to 20 years, working for a master, and they were eventually freed. And they became colonists themselves. But there was a catch, wasn't it? They were freed after 7 or 20 years. They couldn't keep working for these master plantation systems because they were in an indentured servant system, as the British had especially established. They were freed after a certain number of years. As the huge cash crops of sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, and later, as we will see, cotton, became the agricultural lifeblood of these colonies, there began an insatiable need for labor. Who was going to do all this work? That need for labor was never met. It always exceeded its supply. The people that were bringing in slaves at the very first could have brought in 10 times as many as they did. It did not take long for these entrepreneurs in Europe to figure out that the answer to their problem was to be found on the African continent. What was at first just a trickle became a massed, forced migration exceeding 12 million African people. 12 million. This story is a human tragedy of immense proportions with reverberations that we are still dealing with today. Most of these slaves were supplied by powerful African lords who were raiding their enemies in the interior of the continent and selling their captives to the slave ships on the coast. Even today, we see this tribalism is still damaging the African people on the continent. This kind of exploitation and tribalism are still damaging, I think, the African nations. When you see your little booklets and you can look at some of the various maps I have, the very first couple there do show some of the areas that they were drawing slaves from. Even has a pretty interesting map on the Virginia percentages of where various folks, that she has that one up now, that one with the black continent there, showing where most of the Virginia slaves came from, various countries. One of our basic problems, of course, was that the New World crops that were beginning to spread were producing vast one-crop economies. And sugar cane was an especially difficult crop to grow because of malaria and yellow fever. That, of course, was grown mostly in the Caribbean and Brazil. And it demanded a large and continuous importation of African slaves. In our area, on the contrary, the Chesapeake region, the Virginia coast, our crop was tobacco, which was gaining huge popularity in Europe. The South Carolina region, for instance, was growing rice at this time. The good thing about this was that it did not require a constant influx of slaves because our slaves weren't dying of yellow fever and malaria at a huge rate, as we can see happen in Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, Brazil. Here's one of our main points tonight, and I'm going to reiterate this several times. It is important to separate the North American style of slavery with that practiced in South America by examining the various plantation systems and the way they were built. In the Caribbean and South America, yellow fever and malaria caused the loss of many, many slaves and required that constant influx. The plantation owners, you can imagine a person sitting in London. He might own 1,000 acres in Jamaica. He might have 500 African, right off the boat slaves chopping his sugar cane. He never even went to live in Jamaica. Quite the opposite takes place when you look at the Virginia colony that has, in quotes, resident owners. These people are living right with their slaves. They're on smaller holdings and they have fewer slaves under their ownership. You can see that this suddenly makes a complete difference between non-resident owners and resident owners. This contradiction is going to come back and forth to us here because quite the opposite was developing here. A new African-American culture develops with every generation becoming more connected to America and less connected to their old African roots. In Virginia and Maryland, we can see the resident slaveholding mentality begin to develop that will soon produce a far different relationship between slave and owner. The Virginia slave owners worked and lived very close to their, in quotes, people. That's a term I will repeat several times. I find it interesting the way they try to refer to their owned property, slaves, as their people. You will see this all over the writings on slavery in the South. The Virginia slave owners took better care of their slaves. In an economy that was not so one crop, you grew other foods, and those other foods gave a better diet to the Virginia slave system. And that required a much smaller flow of fresh slave labor from Africa. You can see that there's several graphs that you can look at later. Now, we're not going to pull these out each time, but I want you to remember that you can see some of the percentages, some of the interesting maps right there in your booklet. As their slaves were healthier, better fed, they produced more children. Those children and that larger black population began to be seen very early on by the Virginia owners as a new source of revenue. That guy sitting in London that owns that Jamaica sugar plantation, he doesn't see that. He just wants a whole bunch of young men to come in there and chop that sugar cane. Far different when you have a Virginia slave owner who may have been growing up as a child right beside these young black kids that he's with, growing up with them. He sees them as his future, and they are his main source of value. They're the most valuable thing he possesses. Not the land, it's those slaves. That's where his value in his future is going to come from. This was also happening to the white owners when they were leaving their European culture behind. They too are forming a new American sensibility, a new American culture. And you can see how both black and white are symbiotically creating a new and pervasive slave economy. And it will even have social and religious underpinnings by the time we have the 1840s, 1850s. It is important to remind ourselves the history of slavery is one based on violence and subjugation. From the very beginning on the African mainland, this system abused and destroyed families and whole tribes. African slave raiders sold their captives into a new world system that had discovered cheap labor to be the answer for quick profits. The African people were used to supply European capitalism with new products like sugar and tobacco and cotton. It was hugely valuable. The trading networks for these products were spreading also, and the supply of labor, as I've said, was always lacking. Only later will it become obvious that the forced transplantation of Africans to points all over the Western Hemisphere were going to permanently alter the political and racial makeup of the entire New World. The control of the slave trade, and you'll see some of the listings on there. I like that one of the listings explains what cities these slave ships were fitted out in. Bristol, Liverpool, and London. Gives you an idea of how the English were deeply involved in the slave trade. It passed at its peak through various countries. Portugal, Spain, the Dutch were heavily involved in the slave trade, and eventually the British. We have heard all of the horror stories of the Middle Passage, where hundreds of thousands of African people died in the holds of overcrowded slave ships. You'll see some of their terrible figures in the data that you're looking at. These are horrible stories. Naturally, we won't go into it very distinctly, because it's the kind of story that you hardly want to imagine. I just read an interesting quote. Sea captain for a slave ship realized that when some of his slaves had disease on board, it was much better for him to throw those slaves live off the ship, to the tune of 180 people off this one ship, than let them die on board, because he had insurance for drownings. That's the kind of system we're looking at. The trading networks were passed economically through a variety of countries. I can only say that the British began to feel guilty. And when these gruesome facts were shown to the British, a very strange thing happened. And it doesn't happen very often in world history. The British actually made the right moral decision. Doesn't happen very often. They were making millions of pounds off these slave traders. They actually stopped the slave trade. We'll talk about that in a second. To return to the development of the very paternalistic slave system that was being established in the southern colonies of North America, we need to talk about how this process worked. With resident owners growing up right beside their slave children, there began a personal interdependence between master and slave. Many slave owners felt that they cared very much for their people and defended slavery on many fronts as being benign and even positive for slaves. The better treatment and varied diet of the slaves in Virginia showed that this paternalism did have some beneficial realities to it. A natural rise in the slave population can be seen in Virginia that contrasts strongly with a very small natural increase in population in places in the Caribbean and in Brazil. Recent scholarship has shown that the sugarcane producing areas were especially hard on laborers and required that constant flow of new African labor. Mostly young men, remember. Very hard to establish families. Whereas the resident owners in Virginia, North Carolina, even South Carolina, began to see slave families as being a new form of revenue. Especially when they began to realize that their ground and their soil was being burned up from overproducing tobacco. They had grown so much tobacco so quickly that their soil would no longer produce anything. But what did that leave them? Large slave families. Those became the value, not the work of those slaves. The value became the slaves themselves. This will become very obvious later. We should also mention the fact that thousands of African Americans were now in the category of free people of color. because of having been part of the indentured system of earlier times, or on account of being freed by owners, which did happen occasionally. In the northern colonies, very common to free slaves. In the North, by 1810, 3/4 of all blacks were free. And by 1840, virtually all of the black people were free in the North. Now, let's not confuse this with actual social freedom. We realize that they are still oppressed, still are having a hard time getting an education, still have very low-class jobs in the North. It was during the Revolutionary period from 1770 through 1810 that slavery came under very serious attack, even by the famous Virginia intellectuals like Jefferson. But their hopes and predictions that slavery would wither away, proved to be very far off the mark as the rise of the cotton empire came to be so valuable in the southern states. Jefferson's later blunt statement, maybe some of y'all heard that, it's like holding a wolf by the ears. Jefferson was referring to the fact that you either choose justice by ending slavery, or you keep hold of that wolf because your survival depends on that wolf's power. And as we all know, they didn't let go. The cotton system, in fact, one needs to realize that with the invention of the cotton gin around 1793, cotton production rose from about 3,000 bales in 1790 to 178,000 bales by 1810. Then it surged more than 20-fold, surpassing 4 million bales on the eve of the Civil War. And I like this fact here. This is interesting here, this fact. Cotton was America's leading export in dollar value compared to all other American exports combined. Can you see how valuable that slave economy was? Both to the North and the South. The North is receiving cotton for its cloth manufacturing. The South is exporting cotton all over the world, especially to Britain. The rise of cotton production, largely aided by the invention of the cotton gin, cannot be understated in the resurgence and the western spread of slavery. This agricultural explosion brought money and power to the South that had been slipping with the decline of the tobacco and the rice economies. In the North, there arose a free labor and market capitalism style. That became eventually diametrically opposed to the slave labor system in the South. After all, one of the basic tenets of modern capitalism was that owners would have to bargain with labor to set prices and wages. Slavery never allowed this transaction to take place. This brings up another one of the many juxtapositions. While it is obvious that the slave system was based on this vast, liberal, global world capitalist market revolution, and people were always worried about international prices and shipping, it is important to note that in the South, the master-slave relationship was so deeply, conservatively placed in its social system, it was unchanged basically since the 1690s. The Southern aristocracy desperately was trying to cling to this social system and this labor economic system. They were not going to change their restrictions. The rest of the world was leaving these old ways behind. Both Britain and the United States had outlawed the slave trade in their nations in 1808. And y'all may have read the stories. The Royal Navy was very involved in suppressing the slave trade all over the globe. By 1860, the southern states found themselves clinging to a southern slave system that placed them almost alone in the entire world, except for Brazil and a few smaller economies. Even the autocratic czar of the Russians was giving up on serfdom at this time. Even the serf system was going away. The slave economy was often defended with a series of arguments that twisted back on themselves, claiming that the slaves were better off than their northern workers, that religion was being brought to the ignorant slaves, not that they were ever actually allowed to read the Bible. I assure you folks, in Virginia, starting in the 1680s, black laws were passed that demanded a complete control of slave education. Slaves were not allowed to be taught to read. That's just one of many restrictions placed on slaves. And the system could never allow freedom because, well, the poor slaves, if they were freed, might run rampant, as they did in Haiti and Jamaica. The paternalistic plantation owner was caught in a bind because despite his desire to better his people, the conservative structure of the slave system would never allow the slave to progress past the level of dependent children. They wanted their slave population to remain as a dependent child. The way slaves resisted, and we know there is much slave resistance. It was different in all areas where slavery was used in the New World. Where owners were non-resident, and this is important, where owners were non-resident and slave populations became much greater than the numbers of whites. If the folks are living in London and Bristol and they're getting their sugar cane chopped, they're having to bring in thousands of African slaves. Suddenly, there are revolts, both armed and passive revolts all across the Caribbean and even some in Brazil. But in Virginia, the slave population was usually much smaller than the white. And that means only in certain areas. I'm referring to total population. There were many counties, and you'll see on one of your maps the number of counties all across the South from Virginia clear down to Texas that are more than 50% black. A lot of those counties. You'll see that on that map. The way that the Virginia situation was different, of course, was that many of these slave resistance levels were at the individual. They were not in group form. We see many slaves run away singly or in pairs. We can also find examples of individual slaves turning on their oppressors with violent spontaneity. But a Nat Turner or large group rebellion is very rarely the case. There are reports of slaves doing work slowdowns, stealing food, destroying tools and crops, but these are not widespread unless provoked by unusually harsh treatment. Unfortunately, as the Cotton Kingdom moved further west and south into areas like Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, it became far more common to break up slave families and to sell them, I love this term, down the river. We were all brought up with that term. Oh, that guy sold me down the river on that car deal. Down the river comes from the original selling of slaves down the Ohio and down the Mississippi into the very difficult conditions in Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana, both chopping cotton and sugar cane. Here in our pre-Civil War newspapers, now they're right here, y'all can go right back there on those machines, and you will find advertisements for slaves being brought right past us. If we had the trees to look through and didn't have our beautiful building to sit in, we could look right over there in 1845 and you'd see a long string of slaves going toward the ports in Huntington, here in Charleston, to be sold down the river. We could watch them right here if we were sitting here. That's because the price of cotton was rising, and that meant the price of labor was rising. These slaves became more valuable all the time. I just read an interesting advertisement in a Memphis newspaper. An advertisement made by the famous Nathan Bedford Forrest in his slave selling operations. I quote, 500 Negroes wanted. We will pay the highest price, etc., etc. This ends up by advertising, in quotes, we will have a lot of Virginia Negroes on sale in the fall. Now, folks, what is he referring to? He's obviously referring to the fact that that's a good selling point because those Virginia slaves are supposed to be better taken care of, probably healthier, and might even have been trained in a blacksmithing job or one of the more technical mechanical jobs. That's a selling point that you will see many times in slave sales. The slave's worst nightmare was to have their families broken up. And yet, only in the state of Louisiana were laws passed to prevent selling black children away from their mothers. There were no such laws here in Virginia and conversely, of course, over here in West Virginia. If we looked at these chained groups going past, it must be emphasized also that the people leading them were slave traders. And the rich aristocracy always looked down on these slave traders. They were always considered of a lower class. And you were a rich landowner, you didn't want it to be known that you had gotten in such a financial problem that you had to sell your slaves. You didn't want that to be known because that showed that you weren't taking care of your plantation. Unfortunately, that was the case in Virginia on a large scale. Tidewater, Virginia was not making money growing crops. They were growing crops to feed their slaves because the slaves were what the money was at, right there. That's an important point. The Underground Railroad also ran right through western Virginia. Many slaves escaped to Ohio and Pennsylvania. Once again, I envision ourselves sitting right here and imagining one dark, late night, a small slave family attempting to go around through the back roads, and we could see them right here. The back roads of a small town called Charleston. At night, full of fear and trepidation. I remind people also that the reasons we still do not know much, we don't know much about the Underground Railroad. People claim, oh yeah, that church had an Underground Railroad. Oh, this home of this Quaker over here, they had a secret spot where they hid slaves. Well, the reason we don't know about those a lot, it was secret before the Civil War, it was secret after the Civil War, especially with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and that kind of thing. You kept those facts secret, and they still are. We still don't know many of the areas that had Underground Railroads. The plight of free people of color, forced out of many of the Virginia counties by the black laws, began in the 1680s, and they passed these laws clear up to the Civil War. They kept passing black laws. They were even trying to tax free people of color for the honor of staying in these Virginia counties. I want to point out to you, if you looked in your packet, and this is one time you should look because it's very interesting, and I found it here in the archives when I was working here. Monroe County, you'll see in the back, has a sheet of signatures and sign-ups, free people of color. They were forcing free people of color to register with the sheriff. And you'll see first the 1822 version, I think, or is it 1820? That version shows listings of free people of color. Now, as you go to the next page, I want to point this out because it's telling, I think. By 1850, you will notice that those descriptions of slaves have taken, free people of color, sorry, have taken on immediately a very visceral racial content. Read the descriptions of each of those slaves. A light-colored mulatto, a dark-colored free person of color. You notice how by 1850 we are having much more racial content in these records. The plight of free people of color, I've already done an entire discussion on this, and you can see that on our YouTube presentation. We all know that having free blacks close to enslaved blacks, not a good idea. Not a good idea. When those enslaved black people looked over there and saw a free person of color that had his own setup with perhaps a blacksmith shop and was making money, they were beginning to wonder, why can't I be like that? We must remember also, slave owners often were taking sexual advantage of their female slaves. It's happened for hundreds of years. Jefferson is a prime example. He is known to have established a 38-year relationship with his wife's slave, Sally Hemings. She also happened to be his wife's half-sister. They had 6 children together. 4 lived to adulthood. And stories like this are all over the South. All over the South. You can hear that story repeated many times. I think it's interesting, by 1662, Virginia passed the Partus Laws, P-A-R-T-U-S, the Partus Laws, that ended the old English common law about paternity and stated that the status of any person was related to the status of their mother, not their father. Very useful, huh? Meaning that slave owners could enslave their own children without having to admit their paternity. The slave children that they had with their female slaves, they could openly enslave. There are interesting examples of the opposite occurring when slave owners did recognize their marriages to their slaves and even left their slaves to these mixed race families, as we know happened to the Institute property right here in the Kanawha Valley. But these were very small exceptions. Manumission was only popular in Virginia during the Revolutionary period, when Virginia's intellectuals were having to defend their social system, their peculiar institution, while meanwhile claiming that all men are created equal. Not an easy philosophical juxtaposition to face, I would say. You're trying to write that into a constitution that accepts slavery, but never mentions the word. Never mentions the word slavery. The thing about we can say about Washington, all the good and bad, we can say that at least Washington freed his slaves when he died. Jefferson never had the courage to free his slaves, ever. The development of a broad African-American culture during the 1700s and the spread of this paternalistic slave society in Virginia allowed for a stalemate to develop politically in the United States. The South, as we all know, had maintained control of the presidency and the Supreme Court for most of the elections since Washington held office. Once we subtract the Adamses and Van Buren, almost all of them were slave owners. The President of the United States, 8 out of 12 of the first presidents were slave owners. Slavery became an even more profitable idea when they realized that the price of cotton was always going up. There were fluctuations, of course, but it was usually going up. The Southern intellectuals just You know, they really disapproved of slavery. They didn't like it. Surely it's going to go away. By the 1840s, people began to realize, not going away, getting bigger. When you think of this, of the cotton fields in Texas, you will not believe how huge they are. They're gigantic. The cotton fields in Texas were so huge, they could never have enough slaves. Once the southern states realized that they had lost the presidency to Lincoln in 1860, they quickly began to leave the Union. Just like that, we're out of here. We're taking our ball and we're going home. Immediately when they realized that they were not going to be able to control the future of slavery in the United States, they left the United States immediately, even after controlling basically all forms of government, all the House, all the Senate. When they began to realize that they were losing that grip, they immediately were willing to go to a destructive, bloody war to protect their slave economy. On the southern side, this war was fought mostly by young men who never owned slaves, but they found themselves supporting an entire structure that was based on slavery, and they could see no other choice. And I say alter, because I am of the opinion that after a bitter 12-year struggle from 1865 to 1877, the North was forced to surrender. After a very corrupt election in 1876, they surrendered to an unreconstructed South, in which the African American population was once more enslaved into a new system referred to as sharecropping. This new title is nothing more than peonage. It's slavery in a new name. In the southern states, black people lost their political and social rights, and even now, we're dealing with this legacy. This new tragedy is subject we'll have to wait for later, of course. I hope y'all realize that I've had so little time to try to explain a vast amount of, we could spend 6 months here easily. And I'm going to leave you with just one more idea. We now have, in the United States prison system, more African Americans behind bars than there were slaves in bondage at the height of the slave empire in 1850. Start thinking about that. We must face the real history and stop propagating the false myths that we were raised with in Gone with the Wind. Thank you very much, folks. We have some questions. I do have some other material to show you. Before I do, I want to point out 2 of the books that I got a lot of information on and that I can highly recommend. One is the new book out on the transatlantic slave trade. Very good book. Very good graphs and maps. The other is a basic book on slave history that I can highly recommend by Peter Colchin. And that's a good book to get hold of. This will be available in your local libraries. I'll have it with you right here. And it's in your packet. So you've got that one and this one are both in your packet there. At the back end, I also recommend my bibliography, which is at the back end. Don't pay any attention to those little asterisks I wrote some on there. I don't even remember why I put them on there, so don't pay any attention to those. All right, we have a question.
Yes, sir. Were there any farm owners and plantation owners, and if there were, did they have slaves, or would they have treated them better?
There were definitely slave owners that were black. Free people of color often owned slaves in situations where, especially Louisiana, if you had a rich Creole leave Cuba, come over to New Orleans, buy his way into society, you're darn sure he had slaves eventually. He had them chopping sugarcane. It would be totally, impossible to delineate how well he treated these people or how well he didn't. But I find it interesting, too, that there are stories of wealthier black people in New York, in Pennsylvania, coming back into the South trying to buy slaves into freedom. Virginia passed laws exactly to prevent that from happening. The Black Laws of Virginia. I have a book I want to show you right here. Black Laws of Virginia. A lot of pages. Pretty interesting read. Okay? Yes, sir.
Two questions. And they kind of come from the African origins of Virginia slaves handout that you have here. What were some of the determining factors of where they would get the slaves in Africa? Is it based on, like for instance, the plight of Biafra? I noticed most of them come from there, but right next door, the Windward Coast, there's a lot less. Is it a concentration of populations, or is it...
Interestingly enough, my father just asked me the same question when he saw my thing. The same exact question. I'm going to give you a general answer. There are whole histories about it, especially in this book right here, explaining some of the areas and totality of the numbers and percentages. But you can see that different countries had access to different parts of the coast. The Portuguese were in Angola. The British ended up in the Bight of Biafra. There also, it relates to areas where there are more widespread wars going on, where a large African empire may be going out and stealing more of their enemies or their tribal competitors. So it would depend on many factors, not just one or two, but many factors.
And then the other thing is there a difference in characteristics between the different Africans that come from different regions?
There would be some. There would be some. And by that I mean you have differences in in African tribal people all across the whole continent, naturally. But the facts of their status as lower class, as captives, as people that were considered baggage, that was universal. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
First, I want to make a statement, then I'm going to ask you a question. First, the United States of America is going to have to come to grips with the Civil War. Everybody's hiding it. Blacks don't want to talk about it. Whites don't want to talk about it. And people, and I'm not being nasty, they forget that why so many of us are light and some of them you can't tell what it is because being mixed and they don't want to accept. But the two I want to know, even today, why so much that blacks done was always kept hid from the public. Doing slavery, till just recently, they came out with the man who helped to build the Capitol in Washington, couldn't read or write.
Yes, I'm going to try to answer both questions.
But I want
Go
to
ahead.
say this, within West Virginia, you have so much history in West Virginia of things happening with blacks, with the state, you don't know nothing about it. And I can tell you one thing, and then I'm going to shut up. Everybody knows of General Robert E. Lee's horse, Rattle. That horse was trained by a young black boy about 10 years old. And when General Lee came after him, he was about 14. And before that, he had showed him that fairground in Fairleigh, which then was Greenbrier County. He was 14. That was my grandfather. But people don't know nothing. And it was still today, you can talk to so many people, and they will know of Traveler being one of the greatest horses that ever was.
Still stuffed and on display. I'm going to try to answer that question. That's a large question to answer, but you're talking to a person that talks about it all the time. I have tried to bring this issue up repeatedly over and over again. Through this door, I worked here for 23 years. Every month somebody walks in telling me about how the Civil War was not about slavery. I heard it a million times if I heard it once. I didn't let them get away with it. And we all have that responsibility. We have to face up to that responsibility because it's still being swept under the rug. And there's a million answers to those questions too. Guilt is one of them. Guilt. We're supposed to be a Christian nation. When you think about it, we're supposed to be a Christian nation. Well, I have problems with enslaving people and not letting them even read the Bible and then claiming that you're a Christian. So I've got problems with that. But we could talk about that for a long time. I'll answer a few more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I have heard that there was actually a slave auction in Charleston, West Virginia. When I first read about that, I thought it must be a misprint. I thought they were talking about Charleston, South Carolina. But then someone said that there was, I don't know if it was a slave auction, but a slave block or something.
I can only say yes, yes, yes. Slaves were sold all across every southern state. There are only larger and smaller auction houses, especially as slaves became so valuable. You can imagine how much the price was going up when a slave was worth $1,300 in 1858. It's a lot of money. So yes, there were slaves sold at auction here in Charleston. I'm just not willing, I'm not able to tell you which street it was on or whatever. I can assure you that slaves are sold everywhere. We have to recognize the fact that there are 2,000 slaves working in the Kanawha salt fields. 2,000 slaves are working down there in the Kanawha salt fields. I also wish to remind folks that means that they were the first coal miners because they're digging coal. After they chopped down all the trees, they had to dig coal. And digging coal in those days was in a single shaft, and people died all the time. Those black coal miners died all the time in those unsafe shafts. I also want to remind people that in the salt works, slaves were forced to work 4 hours on and 4 hours off. Imagine what kind of schedule that would make you follow if you were trying to raise a family. I also wish to remind people that many of the slaves over in the West Virginia Kanawha Valley area are rented slaves. Those rich folks over in Richmond, they are renting their slaves out. And the folks that are buying them care even less about their health. I've even seen lawsuits from the folks over in, the rich slave owners over in Virginia. Oh, you gave me back my slave and he was sick. You can see how renting slaves was a very destructive relationship for the slave to be in. Another question. Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned that the current prison population regarding black males is greater now than the total slave population.
I meant African Americans in general, both black and female, female and male.
Height of 1850. What correlation is it? Even though, as we stated, the Constitution does not mention the word slave, but within the first 162 words, that issue is covered and the positionality the slave would be. So now here we are, present day America, and of course that was the foundation for the Roger B. Taney decision in 1857.
Yes.
So what position does that play with this present day population in prison?
Well, naturally, you're opening up a huge other conversation. I would like to just simply relate to the fact that you started off with. The Constitution was desperately trying to end slavery. You've got people in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, in New York, in Rhode Island that are trying to say, okay, now we're surely right. We're going to end slavery in our Constitution, this is in the 1780s when they're beginning to write the Constitution. They know that the Confederation of American States is not going to work out. They're going to write a new Constitution. Every single state down south opposed that. We will not join any union without our peculiar institution being respected. Now, a lot of people thought, oh, well, we'll have to give them 10 years or whatever. Surely slavery's going to go away. Didn't go away. That time period was when both tobacco and rice were going straight downhill. Everybody thought that this would stop. It did not stop. And now, what I'm referring to is, you're giving a philosophical basis for the United States that doesn't recognize black folks as free people. And that's why I think we are still dealing with these racial connotations even now. And I also think that we won't hire folks because we want a huge population of low-paid workers. The labor question is still in I think, part of our problem. They want those low-paid laborers to stay in a mass down there. But that's my own opinion.
Can I say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Right to today, I can walk in Macy's and a clerk will run up to me and ask me, what can I do for you? A few years ago, I was working and they had a store in Pinoy City. It was risk. A lady was walking out with almost $600 or $700 of clothes, and the clerk was looking around. They had one of those things going around, looking at me. Today, it is the same way.
It's called racism. It's the best I can tell. That's what I would call it. Yes, and I would agree with you. It's a word we no longer want to discuss. I think we need to discuss that word. Another question. Yes, sir.
I read this. Is there any truth to it? That America practiced the cruelest form of slavery because they wouldn't educate their slaves. They said we're the only nation in the civilization since the beginning of time that refused to educate slaves.
Well, and I've talked about some of those issues. I'm referring to, and I place this in the fact that they lived so close to their slaves. They were so close to the slaves. It wasn't like the Duke of Petersburg, who had a vast serfdom empire. He never even went close to those serfs. But that guy that owned a plantation in Virginia, he's right there with his slaves. So, yes, he feared that slave population much more than somebody that lived in London and had a plantation in Brazil. Can you see how that fear created a strange juxtaposition? He wanted to take care of the slaves. He didn't want to be cruel, but no, wouldn't even teach him how to read and write, and feared if they taught a slave how to be a blacksmith, what's that slave going to do? Run away to Pennsylvania. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any idea of how many plantations there were in Western Virginia? And what the definition was a certain number of slaves to be a plantation?
The word plantation is very general. A little old Southern lady that writes a great book over in St. Albans talks all about how she had such wonderful times with her slaves, and how close they were. But as far as the number of plantations, not possible. And my reference is, think about the size of a sugar plantation in Cuba and a small tobacco farm in outside of Richmond. Now, that's the difference. A resident and a non-resident slave-owning situation. Yes, ma'am.
Frank, let me help you with the plantation thing. In the 1700s, and any of you come, and I've helped you with your genealogies back in the 1700s, the word plantation is equivalent to saying farm. And so a plantation can have no slaves. In fact, many deeds or wills of the period say, I leave to my son the plantation down by the river. That doesn't imply that they have slaves. We think of that as the as all language matures and changes over time, by the time of the Civil War, we think of plantations in the South and they have slaves. But the original meaning of the word was just simply a farm.
And I'll take you one step further, Jamie. Plymouth
Yes.
was not referred to as a colony. Boston was not a colony. It was a plantation. That word was used, not the word colony, but used as the word for all of the eastern seaboard landings that the British had made. They used the word plantation instead of colony. I also want to state, just a second, but I want to state that right here, African American folks are curious about their genealogical connections. Right here, these folks in the archives can help you discover some of your roots, even going back to the slave population. I have here a comprehensive index, an index of American slave names. There's even what I consider interesting, a book here talking about mixed race people. A very interesting period of time when at first, 1619, 1660, black men were working right beside Irish girls. There was no law that said they couldn't marry that Irish girl after they were freed from their indentured servitude. You have mixed race people immediately. You have a slave that escapes, say it's 1710, he escapes into the Shawnee or the Cherokee people. Well, that guy speaks English. He may be a good person to use as a translator in the fur trade or in trade with the American traders. Those black people are taken into the tribe and marry into the tribe and have mixed race children into that tribe. So there are mixed race folks, both Indian, white, black, all across the eastern seaboard, very early on. But before I answer, I want to ask him to give his question.
Yeah, you did a nice job of leading up to the eventuality of secession, of what was happening with the territories and the states and stuff. One of the flashpoints was Missouri. Civil War between them and Kansas, the Missouri Compromise. What was their reasoning to support slavery in the way that they did when they had no sugar cane, they had no tobacco, they were more like West Virginia than any place else?
How about senators and House of Representative members? That's where the crux comes. As the southern states begin to add up the entire area of the Northwest Passage and all the new states coming online, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, Michigan, you see a series of new states. Every single one is going to be a vote right there in the House and the Senate of the United States. You know what? They're going to start voting against slavery. Now you go to New Mexico, exactly how many slaves are you going to need in New Mexico? You go to Oklahoma, well, you might need a few. The Cherokee kept their slaves and took them to Oklahoma, but not very many. You are not going to be producing a large number of slave states to counterbalance the large number of free states as they come in. This happened right as we're talking about. So the crux is right there. When they begin to realize they're going to get outvoted in the Senate, you can bet they start worrying. Yes, ma'am.
If the slaves managed to escape, was there a statute of limitations on how long they could be looked for, or did they always have to live in fear of being caught and returned?
There are a variety of laws in a variety of the states. I can only tell you that no, not really. Especially in places like Virginia, there's no statute of limitations. Slaves were brought back, even kidnapped. Free people were kidnapped by slave hunters because they could always get $1,000 for a good, healthy, young male. Imagine how much $1,000 was worth in 1840, 1850. A lot of money. Yes, ma'am.
You sort of touched on something that I was curious about. The penal system has been over the history since the 1800s. A large percentage of African Americans within it. And the legislation has code laws and things of that sort. But I was more curious about the amendment that was in place or being, in the legislature, the 13th Amendment, I think, when Lincoln was in office. And the wording in that supported the idea of continuing slavery if these were incarcerated people.
Yeah, in other words, you can see that they're trying to create every kind of loophole they can drive through. That's correct, there are loopholes. And this is depicted in the movie, the most recent movie about Lincoln.
Well, the wording in particular was curious.
That's correct. It was ambiguous. It was a little ambiguous, wasn't it? That let those white senators that were the Democrats in the Senate have a little bit of wiggle room. They had a little bit of wiggle room about voting for their consciences in the end. And I think it's an interesting film, and I recommend seeing it. But I agree with you. It is a very ambiguous statement. So is the Constitution itself. Yes, ma'am.
Somebody asked about the slave market or where you sold slaves. The only town I found that still seems to know where their slave place was to sell slaves is Wheeling. And I don't remember the address, but there is an address in Wheeling, and that's where the slave market was. And that was a big place to sell slaves from. And near Bridgeport, we had a man that raised slaves as a crop to sell the slaves.
That's correct.
He said he could make more money raising slaves than he could any kind of crop.
They didn't need slaves to raise crops. They raised crops to feed their slaves. And there's lots of rich folks up there in Wheeling that joined the Confederate Army too, I might add, folks. Several companies of Wheelanders joined the Confederate Army. I also want to repeat, and you need to utilize your state archives. These folks are here trained to help you at any time, and they are very, very helpful. We have the slave census records here that you need to read. 1850, 1860. It does not have the name of the slave, but it has the owner of the slave's name. That lets you back into time where you might be able to find a slave name that was actually from one of the slave owners. I recommend looking that up. I also think that there are mixed race people, like you've heard the term Melungeon. Has anybody heard that term? It's a mixed race term, and that's a whole new area of research because that mixed race people has a lot of African American blood. But you need to remember, these people in Virginia, when they realized, Jefferson is a good example, when they realized that if they were going to try to free their slaves, these are his own children. If they were going to try to free those slaves, they would face social ostracism. Their communities were tied to the slave system. And I feel for those young Confederate soldiers. They were in a system they did not know an alternative to. They didn't own slaves. Some kid living over in Tennessee, he joins the Confederate Army because he thinks the Yankees are going to come down and take away his farm. It's a process of confusion, intellectual depravity. I can only say that the rich folks get richer and the poor get, you know what. That's what happens. And I think that there are so many more questions. You referred to a whole area of new thought. Perhaps I can come back and we can keep talking, folks, but I appreciate everybody coming.
Thanks everybody for coming out, and hopefully see you in a few.
There's books here too, if you want to take a look at some of these books.